Peter, firstly, can I say thank you very much for hosting me a second time?
It's a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, thank you very much. Because only a couple of months ago when I was here and we discussed speaker design in general, and obviously your speaker design philosophies. And while I was here, I got to look at and briefly listen to a speaker that really interested me. And it interested me because of its history, its story, and you spoke about your personal connection with it as well. And that speaker is the Mission 770, the brand new one, which is next to you. And you can't miss them, can you really? There's a speaker design. But this one here is the original Mission 770 from back in the 1970s. And I wanted to make the most of this opportunity to sit with a speaker's designer and learn as much as I can about the speaker, a real rare opportunity. But I want to start my first question by saying that, I'm a child of the 80s, which definitely explains a lot. And obviously I wasn't around when the original Mission 770 was released, but I know it was a big speaker. I know a lot of audiophiles really liked it, obviously including yourself. So, why? What made this such a standout speaker of its time?
Well, we're going to go back to 1978 when I was reviewing for HiFi magazines, writing a lot, for example, for HiFi Answers. And that meant that I was visiting Paul Benson, the editor, in London. And on one of my trips, I found him sitting on his beanbag, bouncing around to a prototype loudspeaker. He was heavily into a new record which had just come out, which I hadn't heard before, Dire Straits, Sultans of Swing. And I soon found myself sitting on a beanbag next to him, bouncing around to this as well. So, of course, I asked him what it was. And he said, well, it's a prototype of a new loudspeaker from Mission. But what interested me was this was such a departure from the way that I'd seen products designed before. Most of the speaker design around then was done largely by measurement with a little bit of listening thrown in just to make sure everything was all right. This seemed to be like being turned on its head. This was a speaker that was being designed by listening instead of by measurement. As I found out later, Farad did use some measurements, but he was mainly driven by the listening. And I'd been reviewing products for HiFi Answers where I was concentrating on a little catchword that I picked up from the classical music scene called musicality. And musicality, when you're talking about performers, is all about how they interpret the music. What I was saying with HiFi was that a product that was musical, that had musicality in it, was a product that revealed the music rather than just made a noise. Because it's very easy to say something like a loudspeaker, make a pleasant noise, what my grandparents used to call a pleasant tone, to something which really involved you in the music and got you going. And that was something the 770 did in spades. I mean, it just effortlessly got you involved in the music, and that's what immediately attracted me to it.
And Peter, you've obviously designed more speakers than I have had hot dinners, and I've had a lot of hot dinners, as you can tell. But obviously approaching a speaker that you didn't design, because you didn't design, obviously, the original, did you? The original Mission 770. So how do you go about dissecting another engineer's work? How do you go about extracting the bits that you really liked, the bits that really resonated with you, that we just spoke about? And then how do you modernize that speaker, keeping all the bits that you love, but still make it a special speaker for 2022? That must be a really difficult task.
Well, it's not so much about dissecting what another designer has done, because I don't think you can quite do that, because you don't really understand what was going through their head that led you to do these things, as much as to evaluate what the speaker itself is doing, or what any piece of hi-fi equipment is doing. When you sit down and listen, or when I sit down and listen anyway, I'm always listening to what is it that I'm enjoying about this product? What is it that makes it special? And for me, the 770, I've already described what I thought was special about it. So when I approached the design in order to make something that was like it but more up to date, I was looking for that level of musicality. And the more I delved into what made the original great, the more I began to find out some of the processes that Farad must have gone through to get there. And that eventually led me to the new design.
And one big part of the story of the new design is the manufacturing all done here in the UK, with a lot of it being done here at this facility in Huntingdon. So the big question is why? Why manufacture here in the UK?
We wanted with the 770 to really encapsulate that idea of this is a British product. It's got this British sound to it. The British sound was revered in the 70s when I was reviewing product. And that, I think, has carried on. I mean, people still talk about the British sound. I think what we do is we make loudspeakers which are very truthful to the original. It's a sound that has a pedigree going back to 1979 when the 770 was first introduced, but it is bang up to date.
Made in the UK, it's different to assembled in the UK, isn't it? So the cabinets made here, the drivers, the crossover components. So even the stands.
Yes, yeah.
On that, I suppose we should talk about the price, because the price of the speakers plus the stands is £3,499, which obviously is a premium price for a Mission speaker. I'd like to ask you about the specific drivers and the cabinet and the crossover, and then maybe how they compare to the original, because I think that's really interesting, where it's come from and how it's been modernised. Can we maybe start with the mid-bass driver, because I know that's a special part of the original, isn't it?
It was the first time that a commercial speaker company had licensed the patent for polypropylene. Polypropylene was the new buzzword in cones at the time. It had been used in prototype speakers at the BBC, and now Mission had a chance to put that into a commercial loudspeaker. It is a large part of the character of the speaker. It lends itself to a wonderfully lucid midband that really is the key to this invigorating performance. We obviously wanted to keep those elements, but we now know a bit more about what we can do in terms of speaker design. So, for example, the original drive unit from CIAS had what they called DD, dynamic damping, involved, which is a form of electromagnetic damping. And what we do in the new 770 bass unit, we have a full copper cap for the pole piece, and that reduces eddy currents down to a minimum so that we've got a much lower distortion performance. As well as that, you'll see the original has a pure polypropylene, clear polypropylene cone. We can now do a little better than that. We can make it more rigid by including mineral in the makeup of the cone. So this is a more dynamic cone with much more dynamic impact. The voice coil is uprated because, okay, the original was rated for amplifiers between 35 to 100 watts. We need to go better now. So much more substantial voice coil system, much more substantial magnet system, still built on a cast frame, but the whole thing is really, really well engineered. The treble unit, we could make a big advance on that because we can design what we need. This treble unit has a rear chamber which lowers its resonant frequency well below the crossover frequency. The important aspect of that is that we can now use the crossover to define the slope rather than relying on the drive unit to define the slope. Instead of the plastic dome that was used originally, we have a coated silk dome. The reason for that, again, is to make sure that the dome behaves in the way that we want it to. It gives a much clearer, lower distortion sound than the original plastic. So we've made big advances in terms of the drive units.
So there's big advances of the drive units. Does that mean you had an easy ride with the crossover? And I already know the answer to that. That's a joke, by the way. Obviously, I know you did a huge amount of work.
It's a bit of an
in-joke
because the original crossover, as I said, was designed over many iterations. I've no idea how many. It
was 100 plus. Your one was 100 plus, wasn't it?
Mine is version 174. So yeah, I put the same amount of effort in. But as the original crossover was actually quite difficult to decipher. And funnily enough, I did find a fit. It's called a flat delay third order acoustic crossover. Now, I don't suppose Farad originally knew anything about flat delay third order crossovers, but of course, if you design by ear, what you will usually end up with is a crossover slope that works, because that's just the way that nature works in conjunction with science. So what he landed on was a flat delay third order crossover. And once I started applying that to the new 770, things started to fall into place. I have here, as if by magic, this is the original Mark I crossover. Now, it's got a big bass coil, a treble coil, and a couple of capacitors and a couple of resistors. Fairly simple. And the reason that it's so simple is because if you're tuning by ear, and only by ear, it's quite difficult to get the results you want if you've got too many components to play with. It just adds to the complexity. So this is something that Farad and many other designers were comfortable with at the time. I mean, the speakers I was designing in the early 80s would have crossovers very similar to this. But now we have the ability to take things a little bit further. So using the same straightforward slopes, but using partly computer prediction and a lot of listening, we end up with the 770 crossover, which is this.
Do you mind if I hold one?
Yeah.
Oh, that's heavy. It's really heavy.
Yeah. So this may look a lot more complex. Actually, it isn't. We've still got a couple of capacitors and a coil, and the main work is done by the base coil here. The rest of these bits are just to tidy everything up, just to make the slopes even more accurate than they were in the original 770. And you'll see that it's on two boards.
I was going to ask you about that. Why are they separated?
The reason for that is because there is some interaction between the two coils, for the bass and the treble. So if we can separate them physically, then we get less magnetic interaction and much lower coloration as a result. It keeps things that much clearer and makes sure that it's working the way that we want it to. Now, the reason the bass coil is so big on that, in most speakers I normally use ferrite coils, as was used on the original 770. But in this case, I wanted to go for an air core coil to achieve low distortion, whatever level you were feeding into the loudspeaker. Now, it's quite difficult to do because with a ferrite coil, you can keep the dimensions small and the coil resistance is low. With an air core coil, it's such a big thing, literally because the amount of copper that you have to put in is huge. So the wire, as you'll see, is thick, it's low resistance, but as a result, we end up with a big and very heavy coil.
Does that affect the cost? I assume it does.
Oh, yeah, it's massively more costly to do something like that, but well worth it for the performance we want from the 770.
Can you take that back now? It's heavy, Peter. It was really heavy, actually. My arm's aching. Not strong
and the
enough
final aspect is the way that the cabinet's made and the porting system as well. Again, two aspects to that. The original 770 worked on the basis of the research work that had been done by BBC engineers, where they'd worked out that rather than using thick cabinet walls, they could control panel resonance much more readily by having thin cabinet walls and thick mass damping on the inside. And the idea behind that was that most wood, all wood resonates. Most wooden cabinets around that time had very little bracing in and would resonate somewhere around the 400 to 800 hertz region, which is right in the mid-range. It's right where the ear's sensitive. It's the main fundamentals and some of the early overtones of the human voice, for example. It affects instruments like cello quite strongly, woodwind quite strongly. It makes these things sound a bit honky and a bit boomy. So what the BBC engineers found was that if they used a thin wall so that the cabinet walls were more flexible and added mass, they could drive that frequency down. So when you drive the frequency down to around the 250 hertz level, which is in the 770, you've got a thin wall chipboard cabinet with heavy bitumen pads all over the inside of it. You end up with something which sounds much cleaner in the midband because all the resonance is in the bass where it matters less, you don't hear it as much. For the new 770 cabinet, though, we've now got to deal with a music source which has more power in the bass. So we can't get away with what was done in the 770. I don't think so anyway. So we need to design something better. So what we've got in the new 770 is we've actually got two pieces of wood. The outside section is MDF. The inside section is chipboard, just to help break up the resonant characters of both types of woods. And then those are bonded together with a damping layer in between. So what we end up with is a very well controlled cabinet. And I can demonstrate that if you just listen to that, and then listen to the same thing there.
Oh, wow. Do that again, actually, Peter. That's really good. Yeah, it's totally different frequencies.
Totally different reaction.
Yeah.
And the other aspect that we've improved upon is the port. We designed a port which has very heavy flaring on the surface from the inside coming out, so that what that does is the high velocity air in the port actually lowers in velocity as it comes out into the room. We've not only used that flaring on the outside, but we've also used it on the inside, because air moves backwards and forwards. It doesn't just come out, it gets sucked back in as well. So on the inside, we've also got the heavy flaring, but not just that. Because we've got a baffle area around here, this also affects the way that the air behaves when it comes from the port. So we've mimicked that on the inside. We've got another baffle on the inside of the cabinet for the flaring in there as well. So we've got equal reaction in and out, and that you can't measure the distortion from that port. It's unbelievably low. And that allows us to achieve a clean response down to 30 hertz in room, which I think is quite astonishing for such a reasonably sized speaker.
But Peter, a speaker is more than the sum of its parts, isn't it? So it's really interesting,
yeah.
all the improvements and changes and modernising that you've done. But if someone invests their money in the speaker, what should they expect? What type of sound? What type of character? What type of speaker is the new Mission 770?
Well, it still retains the character of the old one. It still has that lucid mid-band, that sort of almost magical recreation of voices and instruments. But what I think you heard, and what I love to demonstrate to people, is the way that the speaker completely disappears. You know, if you close your eyes, you're not listening to a pair of speakers, you're just listening to music. And the sound stage that these set up is completely between and outside the speakers, such that you're hardly aware of the speakers at all. And that's exactly the way I want it. I want listeners to the 770s just to hear the music and not to hear the hi-fi system. That's my goal. But along with that, because of the quality of the components we use, the quality of the drive units, the quality of the crossover, the quality of the internal damping, the quality of the cabinet, all that adds together as a cohesive whole so that you hear exactly what musical performers are doing. And that's important, because if you're going to get that feeling that you want to dance around the room to a piece of music, or you want to, tap your knees or tap your feet, that invigorating emotional reaction to the music is what hi-fi, for me, is supposed to do. And the 770's got that in spades. You can hear everything that's going on, from the top shimmer of the cymbal down to the bottom sonorous notes of a drum. It's all there.
Well, that leads me to my last and most important question. Well, I was looking around and I was looking at the manufacturing of the speakers. I saw there was a speaker 0001. Yeah. The very first production Mission 770s, and I really want to take those home. So can I take those home with me? Is that possible? Obviously not to keep, but to review, obviously, for the channel.
Well, as you're such a pleasant chap and a wonderful reviewer, yes, of course, we'll let you have those.
That question's never ever worked in the past. So Peter, all I can say to you is thank you very much. But thank you very much for hosting me a second time. Thank you for going through all the details for the speakers. It's been really interesting to learn about what I think is going to be an extremely popular speaker. But no, thank you again for hosting me. Thank you for showing me around. And I hope everybody at home's enjoyed the video. So if you have enjoyed the video, make sure you hit the thumbs up button. Subscribe to the Pursuit of Perfect System YouTube channel if you haven't already. I'm sure you have. And I'm taking these home with me, that's a definite. So Peter, I'm going to squeeze them in the car. It's going to be a struggle, but they're going in.